Welcome to BookFilter. I'm Michael Giltz. Today we're talking with Bishop John Shelby Spong, retired Episcopal Bishop of Newark. He's been retired since 2000, but that's a misnomer in his terms. Since then he's been lecturing all over the world, published a string of books, and his latest work out is Biblical Literalism, a Gentile Heresy. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us.
Pleasure, Michael. Good to be with you.
Again, yes, retired is not the word to use, is it?
Oh, I loved being the bishop, but I really love not being the bishop too. It's a good life. You know what retirement ought to be is the freedom to pursue the things that you really enjoy. I enjoy study, I enjoy writing, I enjoy traveling, and I enjoy lecturing. And that's all I do. I don't wrestle with vestries. I don't deal with clergy who are in trouble like I used to. And it's just a wonderful life. I meet incredible people on our lecture tours. So I rather enjoy it.
I've gone 1 minute without using the word controversial yet, but now that will stop. Sometimes when people have a career and they're pushing the boundaries or breaking new territory, they're controversial. And then as time passes on, their ideas or their beliefs become mainstream and they become more accepted and they become a beloved elder figure. I don't think that's happened with you in terms of the church.
It's a little closer.
Yeah.
It's a little closer. I haven't had any death threats since 2000 when I retired.
Thank God for
they
that.
Don't, they don't much care about retired bishops. They don't think they've got any power. But it's fascinating. I've had 16 death threats in my life, and all of them have come from Bible quoting, true believing Christians. Not a one's come from an atheist or a Buddhist or anything like that, which I find kind of interesting. Now, whether they were serious or not, I don't know, but I took them seriously. I get a lot of hate mail. I don't take that very seriously, but when somebody says I'm plotting for you, I at least turn that over to the local police or to the FBI if it's a faraway place. But nothing's ever happened, and I don't have any apprehensions today. I used to, when I worked in downtown Newark, which is a high crime city anyway, I'd be in my office till 11, 12 o'clock at night sometimes, and my car would be parked back in the parking lot with a big sign that says Bishop Spong Reserved. It all just very clear whose car it was. And before I'd go out at that hour of the night, I would sort of search around from inside to make sure I didn't see any people lurking in the shadows. But I never had any. We had the cars vandalized there, and my office was broken into about once a month when we were working in Newark. But that's all changed. Newark has turned around a lot.
Mm-hmm.
The Performing Arts Center is now in the heart of Newark.
NJPAC?
NJPAC.
Yes.
And
a great space.
it is, and it's a great contribution of Governor Tom Kean to the state. And so we have lights down there like we never had before. It's like flying into JFK Terminal. The lights are just everywhere. And police are all over the place, and people are coming in and parking in these parking lots to go to the shows. And you know, all you need to do is have 1 or 2 of those parking lots robbed, and people will stop coming to Newark for those shows. So it's in everybody's business. And my office was literally adjacent to the New Jersey Performing Arts Center, and it wasn't broken into the last 10 years I was bishop ever. And it just makes a difference.
Well, I might have parked in the slot next to the one that said Bishop Spong, just to avoid, why make it easy for people?
Yeah.
But for all the work that needs to be done in the different Christian faiths, you have to feel good about the work in the culture as far as women and civil rights and gay rights, the things that have changed in your lifetime.
In some sense, every cause that I was identified with is now won. Now there's still other causes like war and peace, and whether or not you're going to elect a president who lives in the 21st century or the 18th century. Those are still abroad. But, the civil rights movement was such a romantic and powerful movement in my young life. I didn't march at Selma, but I was well aware of Selma. And I was a very young priest, maybe 25 years old. And I tried to identify with Selma by having our opening hymn be "Lead On, O King Eternal," and I thought that was so clever. To have Martin Luther King in my opening hymn. Not a soul got it in my little community. They just went up and over. But when the desegregation order of the courts came down to the little town I was living in, then it was really a tough time. We had the Ku Klux Klan was very active, and I got named public enemy #1 by the Ku Klux Klan. I tell people if you live in a small enough pond, you can be a very large fish. In Tarboro, North Carolina, in Edgecombe County, North Carolina, was a small pond, but I seem to have been the only white person who dared to stand on the side of those little black children who were ordered into the all-white. So I think there were 3 little girls, and it was really hard for those little girls with people screaming and spitting on each side of them. The sheriff was a member of my congregation, and I'd gone to see him basically to strengthen his backbone and to say, his name was Tom Barden, he's deceased now, and to say, Tom, I want to make sure that these children are going to be safe, and if they're not safe, I'm going to walk into that school with them, and you're going to have to arrest your rector. And he guaranteed me, he thought I would be a cause for alarm if I did that. He guaranteed to me those children's safety, and so I did not walk in with them, and he was true to his word. Those children were safe, and it was amazing how quickly they got over it. None of these children raped anybody. I think they were 7. And, you know, nothing fell down all over the building when these 3 little black children came into this beautiful all-white school. But the Klan I was the most untrustworthy white man in town, and we got a lot of night riders, and we got a lot of calls, and we got a lot of threats, and including the threat to rape my daughters with the biggest, blackest, and they would use the N-word. And my daughters at that point were 6, 3, and 1. You know, they were just little children. But we still walked them to school every day and met them at school and walked them back for a long period of time. Those are difficult days. Before I left Tarboro, and I was there for 8 years, before I left I'd been named Man of the Year. And I thought that was an interesting juxtaposition of feelings. And part of it was that the crisis passed and nobody got hurt. And the other part of it is that after time goes by, you realize that your fears are unfounded. And the fears in the South about black people were just unbelievable. If black people go into the movie houses, no one's going to be safe. Everybody's going to be raped or assaulted. And so the only way blacks could go to the theater in the South was to sit in a restricted balcony. And if they went into the city swimming pool, maybe their color would come off and all the white children would turn. There were just incredible irrational fears. But we got through that, and I must say that in that period of time, I was serving 2 congregations, 2 Episcopal churches, 1 block apart, and one was white, and one was black. That was the law of that land. Today, I go back to Tarboro, and both churches, they're still both in existence, but they do all sorts of things together. And they even close each church 1 month in the summer, and they go to the other church so that the minister can have a vacation, so that. And it's really just incredibly different to see it, and it's so gratifying. And also the people, what happens in great moments of transition is that the world, that people don't change, but they die. And I don't mean to wish them ill, but I knew people in the power structure of that little town that could no more have adjusted to
the world today.
Yeah, they could not have made it. They could not possibly have eaten a meal with a person of color without becoming physically ill. And what happened is that they died, and their children adjusted much better, and their grandchildren don't even know there was a problem. And it's kind of almost wonderful. I think about the political struggles that we go through. And one of the things that people don't recognize is that in every election for a president, 8 years has changed the electorate. That is, 4 years of voters have become 21 or 18 above, and 4 years of voters have died. So there's an 8-year swing in the electorate. If Mr. Obama finishes his 2 terms, there will be a 16-year swing in the electorate. Now, he's had a very difficult time getting along with the white power structure. But the fact is that after a 16-year shift, it's not going to go back. And nobody that knows anything about history thinks it's going to go back. So if they keep nominating people who are rooted in that past, they're going to keep losing. Even Texas, which is such an interesting state, even Texas, it's going to be maybe in the next 5 years that they have an Hispanic majority. And then the present politicians in Texas won't be electable anymore. And they're bound to know that. Maybe that's why they're trying to restrict voting.
Of course, it's a purple state already.
Yeah, well, it's really kind of amazing to watch that. But if you're patient enough, you know you're on the right side. If you've got truth on your side. And when you get to the women's issue, and I didn't get to the women's issue until I was in Richmond. It was many years later. But my church would not ordain women. Well, they do now, and about a third of our bishops are female, and about 50% of our clergy are female today. My rector is a woman, and she's a very gifted woman, and I'm really grateful to have her, and we enjoy being part of her flock. But that, when I was the bishop, to struggle to get a woman considered for at least anything except a church that nobody wanted to go to. We could get women into those. But today, the largest churches in this diocese, and the one I attend is probably our second or third biggest church, and they called a woman and didn't even think it was unusual. And then she called a lesbian to be her assistant, and nobody thought that was unusual. That was the third big battle. But those battles have gone on. And you see, the thing that's bothered me most, that in every one of those battles, the Bible was quoted on the side of segregation, on the side of oppression of women, on the side of condemning gay and lesbian people. And so either there's something wrong with the Bible, or history is moving toward total degeneracy. I don't happen to believe it is. So part of what I've done is to try to go back and look at the Bible and see where we began to misinterpret it. And the Bible, interestingly enough, has been on the losing side of every public dispute since the Magna Carta. You know, we backed King John, the church backed King John against the Magna Carta. And then we used the Bible to justify slavery, and we didn't educate women in this country until the end of the 19th century. They couldn't go to major universities until after World War II. And yet we've got a woman standing on the precipice of being elected president of the United States today. And she ran 8 years ago and came very close. You know, that's just, those are the things that are so different. And today, the court, a court with majority Republican conservative appointees, backed gay marriage. And it was a Roman Catholic, Anthony Kennedy, that did it. And he was really a remarkable justice at that point, and clear and concise, and that opinion made it almost impossible for that decision ever to be overturned. And 5-4 majority, and he's a swing, and that's, you know, the other four are pretty set in both directions, but he was a swing, and it'd be interesting to see in the new court. Somebody will always be the swing vote, but it'd be interesting to see who it will be.
Well, that brings us to your book, Biblical Literalism, a Gentile Heresy. And it's an attempt to look at the Gospel of Matthew in particular. And it's an ongoing project of yours, looking at the Bible in the different areas. And obviously building on the work of others and pointing out that it seems likely that certainly the book of Matthew, and in fact the three liturgical Gospels, is that the proper term? Mark, Matthew, and
Synoptic Gospels. Yeah.
Mark, Matthew, and Luke were built around the Jewish liturgical year.
I'm absolutely convinced of that, but it's not an original idea. My mentor at that point was an English New Testament professor named Michael Giltz, who taught at the University of Birmingham, who died 3 or 4 years ago. And Michael, when I first met him, which was about 1991 or 2, he saw it was like having a jigsaw puzzle, that the missing piece, that linked everything together, was not there until I met Michael. I've been working in this area. The first book I wrote was entitled This Hebrew Lord. Came out in 1972, and it was an attempt to take Jesus and put him into a Jewish context and then read him and see if that was a different context from the Jesus of medieval power, which we've had in the West for so long. And it was just an illuminating experience for me. And then I did a dialogue with a rabbi in Richmond that was still one of the highlights of my life. We had 1,100 people attending the synagogue or the church, depending on which setting we were in, for about 8 weeks, and we published that. And Richmond, you know, Richmond is a city that had Jewish neighborhoods. I mean, they would not sell houses to Jews in certain neighborhoods, so the Jews all lived in a certain neighborhood, segregated. They had no Jewish members of the various country clubs until the Jews founded their own Jewish country club. So there was a lot of division. And to watch that city come together in that dialogue, and that rabbi is still one of my closest personal friends, it was just it was a life-giving experience. It made me aware that you don't shrink back from opportunities because you fear they're going to be controversial. You know, what happened was that those two congregations got so close because they worshiped together regularly. I'll tell you one story that just epitomizes this. The head of the synagogue, a layman, this dialogue took place in the fall, so we'd been in each other's church or synagogue for 4 Sundays in each, and 4 Fridays. And Christmas came shortly after, and the president of the synagogue and his wife came to our Christmas Eucharist midnight service. And there was nothing unusual about that. He'd been there a lot of times, so we were sort of glad to see him. But when time came for communion, he came up to receive communion. That was a bit unusual. And I don't ever deny anybody who comes up and stretches out their hands. I don't care what the situation. So I gave the bread and the wine of the Christian Eucharist to this Jewish man and his Jewish wife, who were the head of the synagogue. And I didn't think anything much more about it. I did wonder what it meant. But I saw him on the streets of Richmond a week later, and I said, "Joe, I'm so glad to see you in church on Christmas Eve. Thank you for coming." And he responded by saying, "Jack, I bet you were surprised that we came up to receive communion." And I said, "Well, I was, but tell me what that meant to you." And he said, "Well, isn't the communion based on the Last Supper?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Weren't all those people around that table Jewish?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Had any of them ever been baptized or confirmed?" And I said, "No." And he said, "And they received the bread and the wine from Jesus?" And he said, "Well, I thought if all those Jewish people could receive the Eucharist from Jesus, that it wouldn't be a big problem if I received the Eucharist from you, because we were so pleased at the result of our dialogue together." I was so touched by that. It just almost brought tears to my eyes. And when you look back at Auschwitz and the murder of 6 million Jews at the hands of an ostensibly Christian European nation of Germany, where most of our biblical scholarship and most of our theological giants have come, that was just a step in the right direction. That's not one of the 3 big movements, but for me personally, that was probably the most determinative movement. And then I went to Oxford and I guess it was Cambridge. I went to both of them. This was Cambridge. And while I was at Cambridge, I was working on the birth narratives. And I spoke to the chaplain of Magdalen College. His name was Jeffrey John. And I told him what I was doing. And he said, have you got any resources you recommend? And he said, "Well, the birth narratives are nothing but Haggadic Midrash." Mm-hmm. And I said, "What?" And he said, "Have you not read Michael Golder's work?" And I said, "Never heard of Michael Golder." And so he told me about Golder. And so I went to the store and I bought the first Golder book. They only had one, and it was his commentary on Luke. And it was the most expensive book I ever bought. I think it was 140 pounds, and that really shocked me when I picked the book out and tried to pay for it. But anyway, I read his book, and it's really tough going. And then the next day I went to the library, and the Bodleian, I was at Oxford, I went to the Bodleian Library and to see what Golder books they had, and I checked out all they had. And I read them. One was called Midrash and Lection in Matthew. And I was so moved by that book that I immediately called this man up and told him that I'd been deeply moved by his work and wondered if he'd be willing for me to come over and spend some time with him just to ask him a lot of questions, and he was very gracious. So my wife and I, Christine, drove to Birmingham, University of Birmingham, and met with Michael, had lunch, and spent the afternoon. And I've never had an experience like that in my life. Because what he said was that you can't read the New Testament unless you recognize that they're Jewish writers and they're writing to a Jewish audience. The Gentile presence in the Christian church came much later. Matthew's written in the early 80s, maybe as late as 85. There were almost no Gentiles in the church at that point. So when they write about Moses, about King Herod going down to Bethlehem and killing all the boy babies, every Jewish person would have known that's a Moses story about the Pharaoh going down to Egypt, killing all the Jewish boy babies.
It's an echo of an earlier story.
Yeah, they would never have thought that that was literal. And even more controversial, he said, look, Matthew's the one that introduces the virgin birth. The virgin birth nowhere in Paul, nowhere in Mark. It doesn't come until Matthew introduces it. And go back and look at how he introduces it. He introduces it with a 17-verse genealogy that traces the DNA of Jesus from Abraham down to Jesus. And look at who he puts in there. He has 4 ancestral mothers.
Each of them pretty controversial in their
Each
way.
each of them in the biblical text, each of them very controversial, each of them by the standards of their day, sexually compromised women. One is guilty of incest, one is guilty of prostitution, one is guilty of seduction, one is guilty of adultery. Now, why would Matthew introduce the virgin birth story that way if that's literal biology that he's talking about? So it's just a whole new... Then he says, now look at Joseph. Joseph is never mentioned in any Christian writing until Matthew introduces the virgin birth, because there's no reason to talk about Joseph, so he never appears. And when he does appear, you have to raise the question, did nobody know about him until the 9th decade? Or was he made up in the 9th decade? And so you assume that maybe he was made up, maybe he's a literary character like Harry Potter and not like Abraham Lincoln. And so you raise that possibility, and then you go back and say, well, if that's a possibility, let's look at what it might mean to Jewish people that the father of Jesus is named Joseph. And then you get back into Jewish history, and you recognize that the Jewish nation has always been divided, and it goes all the way back to Jacob marrying 2 women, Rachel and Leah. And Leah, the older daughter, is the mother of Judah, which is the major tribe of half of Israel. And Rachel is the mother of Joseph, who is the primary patriarch of the northern half, so that Jewish history is divided between Judah and Joseph. Roughly. And so the Messiah, one of the tasks of the Messiah is to bring these 2 factions together. Matthew's genealogy says that he's the descendant of David, so that takes care of Judah. So to make his earthly father, Joseph, who validates him, who authorizes him, who protects him, who names him, make him Joseph, is to bring the Joseph people and the Judah people together. Well, that's just incredible insight to me that I've never thought about. And then he goes on and he says, now, where does he get the biography for Joseph? There are 3 things that he'll tell you about Joseph in Matthew 1 and 2. It's the only place you get biographical data. He tells you he's got a father named Jacob. He tells you that God only speaks to him through dreams. Mm-hmm. And he tells you that the role of Joseph in salvation history is to save the child of promise, and he saves him by taking him down to Egypt to get away from King Herod. Now go back and read the Joseph patriarch story in Genesis 37.
Joseph of the amazing...
He's got a father named Jacob. He's identified with dreams. His role is to save the people of the covenant from death by taking them down to Egypt to avoid a famine. And you suddenly put that together, and I say it today to audiences, and they've never thought about this, and they say, of course he's a literary character. Of course he's not historical. And then you go through everything else, and Matthew was the gospel I used because in the early church it was thought to be the first. That was inaccurate. They used to think Mark was a Reader's Digest version of Matthew. Now we know that Matthew copied and expanded Mark. But Matthew is also the one that sort of links the old with the new. The genealogy sort of connects Malachi with the Christian story. And so it's a good one to use. But you can see these Jewish connections. Jesus never took 5 loaves and 2 fish and fed 5,000 people. That's a Moses story. Manna in the wilderness is always out in the wilderness. And the big difference is that Moses had to pray to God to send the manna. Jesus did it himself. Matthew is quite clear that Jesus was superior to Moses, and he does that in a number of episodes. The Sermon on the Mount is only in Matthew. Why is it in Matthew? Because the Jews are celebrating their Shavuot holiday, their Pentecost holiday, 50 days after Passover. And what that celebrated in the Jewish synagogue was the time when Moses got the law from God on Mount Sinai. So how do you portray Jesus? You put him on a new mountain, a new Moses, to give a new interpretation of the law, and you base the Sermon on the Mount on Psalm 119, which most Christians don't know anything about. But Psalm 119 was a psalm written by the Jews for use at Shavuot, at this holy day, because it was a 24-hour festival. That's why Psalm 119 is so long. It's 176 verses, or 172 verses, I don't remember.
They need to do something for each hour.
Something for each of the 3 hours of the 8 3-hour segments of the 24. And the opening stanza has 8 verses, and 2 of them start with the word blessed. So Matthew takes his opening stanza, makes it the Beatitudes, not 2 of them, but all 8 of them start with the word blessed. And that psalm is divided into 8 segments because they had to go through 24 hours. So Matthew divides his Sermon on the Mount into 8 segments. He's got 8 Beatitudes, and he's got a commentary on each of the 8 Beatitudes. That's what the sermon is. So once you get inside it, it looks so deeply Jewish, and you don't raise questions like, I wonder where the mountain was that he preached the sermon, because that's not what it's about. It's about seeing Jesus as a new Moses, even a greater Moses. And I don't want to be supersessionist, but Matthew is writing from the perspective of a Jewish person who has found an ultimate meaning in Jesus that relativizes the meaning he found in all of his Jewish heroes. So we're talking about Matthew's experience. We're not talking about the Christian God is superior to the Jewish God, but that gets heard that way sometimes.
In a way, what you're saying is if you want to be a good Christian and understand the Bible and the Gospels well, you need to be a good Jew first and foremost.
Yeah, it'd be hard to say it that way. You certainly need to understand Judaism and see the scriptures through Jewish eyes. Mm-hmm. The Jewish people were storytelling people. Most Middle Eastern people are storytelling people. And they didn't have the modern technique of telling you whether the story is really true history or not. You know, we do. We say once upon a time. If I were to start telling you a story and say once upon a time and then tell you the story and then wind up saying he lived happily ever after, you would know that that was not history, that's a narrative of it. The Jews they hadn't invented a way of doing that yet. So what they did was to exaggerate. So you get Jonah and the whale, except the whale is never a whale in the text, it's just a great fish. Mm-hmm. But the idea that a man can be consumed whole by a great fish swimming out in the Mediterranean Sea and can live in the belly of that great fish for 3 days and 3 nights before the fish throws him up, and then he lands on a little sandbar in the middle of the Mediterranean. But if you're writing a story, you can locate that sandbar anywhere you want to. You don't have to worry about the abnormality of such a thing. That's an exaggerated story. It's a story about prejudice. It's a story about trying to keep Jews and Gentiles separate, and it's a powerful story, but it's not a literal story. Well, I think there are a lot of things that we've treated as literal. I think the Red Sea splitting so they can walk across on dry land is an exaggerated Jewish story. It wasn't the Red Sea anyway, we now know, because if it was the Red Sea, they went 200 miles out of their way. And it's 20 miles long in the Red Sea, and they crossed this sea, which in Hebrew is Yam Suf, but that literally means the Sea of Reeds. They cross it in a period of time that would mean that the Jews had to be averaging 12-minute miles if it's the Red Sea. Well, a bunch of wandering exiled slaves.
Carrying everything they own.
Carrying everything they own. Some of them old people on walkers and some little children running around and some pregnant women and nursing babies and everything. They're not going to average 12-minute miles. I run every morning on my running track. I don't average 12-minute miles. That's a pretty good pace. I average about 3 miles an hour, I guess. A 12-minute mile would give you almost 5 miles an hour. They're not going to do that. So, this story doesn't make literal sense, but it makes profound sense when you begin to peel back the layers.
That's one thing people often get confused with your work. They think you want to tear things down, demystify them, make them less somehow, when in fact you're trying to get to the heart of it and what matters to it.
Well, you see, what we've done is to live in what I call a Gentile captivity of the Hebrew Scriptures for almost 2,000 years. I don't mean to be negative about the Gentiles. I am one, I assume. But what happened in the Christian church is that it was born as a movement within the synagogue. We weren't called Christians. We were called the followers of the way. And the way is a phrase taken out of the book of Deuteronomy. It was a special way of being Jewish. And we didn't break off from the synagogue until about the year 88. We can't be quite certain of that. It could have been 87, it could have been 89. But there came a time when the Jewish Orthodox Party could no longer tolerate what they call revisionist Jews, which is what the Christians were. And so they excommunicated them after a council meeting in Jamnia, which was around 88. And at that moment, the Christian church and the synagogue separated. John's gospel is the only gospel that's clearly written on the other side of that separation. Luke's gospel might have been, but he was so dependent on Mark, his whole basis is on the previous side of the. But John, in chapter 9 of John's gospel, the story is told of the blind man who received his sight and was thrown out of the synagogue, and you get the pain of excommunication of the followers of Jesus in that chapter. And it's written maybe 95, so it's after. And it causes John to try to find a new way to talk about Jesus except through messianic fulfillment, and that's when John, I think, goes into what I think is a kind of Jewish mysticism, and that's why Jesus becomes pre-existent, and before Abraham was, I am, and the I am saying sort of take the name of God and to put them into Jesus' mouth was a claim, because the Jews, the Orthodox party was saying, you are no longer part of the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses. And John writes his gospel and has Jesus say, I am, putting the name of God into the mouth of Jesus to say, oh yes, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses is the same God that people believe they're confronting in my life. So it's, again, a really great way to read the scriptures. If I had stayed a fundamentalist, I'm sure
And that was what you were raised?
Yeah, I was raised a fundamentalist in an Episcopal church. It taught me that segregation was the will of God. It taught me that men were superior to women. It taught me that homosexuals were either mentally sick or morally depraved, and it taught me it was okay to hate Jews and other religions. And it quoted the Bible to prove that all of those things were proper. And if I hadn't been able to find a different way to read the New Testament and to be a Christian, I long ago would have left the Christian faith. So far from destroying the Christian faith, what I hope I'm doing is opening it up so that more and more people can see something in it that makes sense and that's not rejecting of so much that they know is wrong. It took me a long time to work out from under the prejudices of my childhood. And the idea that the Christian church is the primary articulator of the prejudices that warped my life is a strange thing, a realization to come to, but that's exactly what I came to. I never met a good Jew in Sunday school. Every Jew was evil. They had bad names like Annas and Caiaphas and Judas Iscariot and Sadducees and Pharisees. And nobody ever told me that Jesus was a Jew. That just escaped their memory. And all the disciples were Jews. And I'd see pictures of Jesus, and I was quite sure he was not Jew. He looked Swedish to me. He had blonde hair, blue eyes, and fair skin. That made no sense to me. But my prejudices I learned in my church. My prejudices against women, my prejudices against gay and lesbian people were all taught to me in my church. Now, if prejudice diminishes the humanity of the person who is the object of your prejudice, as I'm convinced it does, then what kind of Christianity is it that you're taught that enables you to diminish a fellow human being on the basis of something they are and not something they do? I think it's okay to condemn the behavior of Saddam Hussein if you want to, or bin Laden. Sometimes human behavior is quite destructive. But you don't condemn a person on the basis of the color of their skin, or the gender of their body, or the sexual orientation of their life, or even the religion in which they were raised. Those are prejudices that diminish humanity. And if the Christ story means anything, it means that Jesus came, in John's words, that we might have life and have it abundantly. I can't have abundant life if I spend most of my energy trying to build me up by pushing you down or someone else down. And so that's the contradiction in these things, and that's why I make no bones. I don't try to protect the sensitivities of fundamentalist people. And it's not that I'm anti-fundamentalist. I am one. My mother died one. At least I was one. My mother died one. But what I do is to see that fundamentalism has been so destructive to the humanity of so many people. We need to remember we justified slavery on Christian principles, and the Pope owned slaves at one point. The region of my country that celebrated slavery was called the Bible Belt, and it's still there. And the prejudice is still present in it too. I don't think you can understand the conflict in Washington today if you don't understand that there's some people that will never accept an African American as president of the United States. I don't care who he is, I don't care what he does, they will never accept him. And so he has to live with stuff that no other president ever had to live with. No other presidents had his birth in the United States questioned the way Obama's was questioned, despite birth certificates from Hawaii. Well, Hawaii's not really America anyway, you see. And those are the things that the prejudices still affect our world. And it's wonderful, Mike, to be on the other side. It's wonderful to see your culture treat women in a different way. to see your church treat women in a different way. To have women become ordained in my church is one of the greatest things my church has ever done. Not because the women were different, but because the women brought an intuitive difference into the priesthood and broke up some of our hierarchical thinking and began to develop more circular thinking. You can see the impact of women because they sort of operate differently from the way men operate. They're not bound by career paths the way men are. And it's just wonderful to watch that take over the whole church.
And you've seen in Christianity in general, beyond the Episcopal Church, obviously Catholicism is the largest single number of Christians, and you've seen, I think, over the last 200 years, sort of retreating from that fundamentalism. It used to be, of course, that they taught every word of the Bible was literally true. They've sort of retreated step by step from the Old Testament. Now I think basically they're reduced to the Gospels and clinging to the idea that the Gospels are literally the Word of God.
I think that's exactly right, and yet everybody that studies the Gospels knows that Matthew not only copied Mark, but he left things out of Mark, he corrected Mark, and he expanded Mark. Now, if Mark is the Word of God, Matthew wouldn't have done that. Mm-hmm. It's okay to expand, correct, and change the Word of Mark. It's not okay to expand, change, and correct the Word of God. And yet the propaganda is still there in my church, and I suspect in yours too, on a Sunday morning. When the lessons are read, we end the lessons by saying, "This is the word of the Lord," and everybody responds, "Thanks be to God." Mm-hmm. Well, there's sometimes when the lesson is read and you don't want to blame God for that, like wives obey your husbands, slaves obey your masters. I remember sitting in my church on a Sunday morning behind a couple who had lost 2 of their children to tragic accidents. And the lesson was the prophet Nathan confronting David and Bathsheba after their adulterous relationship, and telling them that because of their sin, the baby was going to die. And then they said, "This is the word of the Lord." And I'm sitting behind this couple who's lost 2 children, and that message said it was somehow their sin that caused them to lose their children. If I hadn't been a bishop, I would have stood up and said, "No, that is not the word of God," but I have to be dignified when I'm a bishop, and so I just sat there and absorbed it. But what I did is I write a weekly column, and so I used that as a topic of a weekly column, so the message got out, but I was just churning until I had gotten that. I just can't stand that. I don't even like what we call the gospel procession, because the gospel is held up as we walk down into the congregation as if it's a book to be worshipped. You can't study a book that's to be worshipped. You can't be critical of it. You can't look back at its sources. You've got to sort of accept it literally. I think we ought to make our liturgy reflect what we really believe. I also find it interesting, and I'm probably talking too much, I find it interesting that the Bible is printed with 2 columns on each page. Mm-hmm. I don't know who started that, but if you look at our society, the only things that are printed with 2 columns on each page are the dictionary, the encyclopedia, and maybe the telephone book. Nobody ever reads any of them. You go to them for answers. Who was it in our dark history that decided the Bible was a book of answers, and so you print it like you do an encyclopedia? I think that's part of the propaganda that makes looking at the Bible realistically and critically very difficult for a lot of people to do. And we haven't done it. It's about 200 years that we've looked at the Bible critically in Western civilization. But up until that time, we were all pretty much fundamentalist.
Well, whenever someone says they take the Bible literally word for word, I always say, "Oh, which one?"
Yeah.
Because, of course. But you want to be a Christian without closing your heart, and you want to be a Christian without closing your mind, I think is another key idea.
Yes.
That you just simply, you can't, you feel Christianity and the Gospels can't survive the message that's important if it's so clearly.
Well, and it's also biblical because Jesus enjoins us to worship him with our hearts, our souls, our minds, and our strength. I don't see how you could worship Jesus with your mind if you're not allowed to be critical about the Holy Scriptures. If you think the Scriptures are going to collapse because you're critical, you really already don't believe in them. You're just trying to protect them. I think it's Sigmund Freud that said anytime you've got to claim that you have the source of ultimate authority and that nobody can interpret it but you clearly don't believe it. You don't have to build that many walls around something you really believe. And that sort of reveals that you're not committed to this point of view. It's just propaganda. Well, I think we've got to free ourselves. The Christian church is not winning today. It is dying. in all advanced societies. The only place it's growing is in primitive societies or societies where the population has not had the privilege of education. And you know, that the people of Africa and the third world are not less intelligent than any of the rest of us. They just had less opportunity. And so do you not think that the Internet's going to bring universal education to everybody in the world eventually?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what's Christianity going to look like when you can no longer say that this is the literal Word of God? Is there still going, if you've attached Christianity to that perspective, what's going to happen when that perspective is impossible?
We're not to follow medical advice of the government and every medical doctor
correct.
to say, let's use a condom for now while we have a Zika
You know,
virus.
Anglican bishops meet once every 10 years all together from all over the world, and I met in 78, 88, and 98 with my brothers and sometimes sisters by 98 from all over the world. And it was an interesting clash of cultures as much as there was anything else. I remember talking to a bishop, I think he was from Chad, or it might have been the Sudan, and he told me about his theological school where he had trained for the ministry, and he said our library had 35 books in it. And the most recent theological book was in the 1930s. Well, there's nothing quite so out of date as a 30-year-old theological book. I've seen them. And the idea that they're confronting the modern world with the mentality that would be expressed in a 70-year-old, 80-year-old book on theology or even biblical studies is just ludicrous. And if you can get through the threat, and that's always, you know, I was not the most popular bishop with the third world bishops because they saw me as somebody tearing down their understanding of Christianity. That was really not my intention, but that's the way they saw me. And so they were threatened and they put their guard up. I remember a bishop who was living in a country where they had a lot of terrorists, an African bishop, and he got a telephone call that he needed to take care of a crisis 30 minutes away. And while he was away, a group of terrorists came in and killed his wife and 2 children. He adjusted to that by saying God needed me because God sent me that telephone call to get me out so that I wouldn't be there and I wouldn't be killed too. And as he told this story, I said, well, if God can do that, why didn't God get your family out at the same time? He got hysterically angry. And his whole defense against the grief, which I'm sure is real, of losing his wife and children, was taken away because he hadn't thought about that. And he just had thought, God has gotten me out and saved me for the vital work of being a bishop, but didn't save my wife and children. Well, if God can get you out, friend, God can get your wife and 2 children out too. But it's just amazing to me the hysterical kind of response that brought in that conversation.
Did you ever speak to him later? Or
we tried, but he was, you know, I know what it means. I've lost my first wife. I know what it means to be in grief about losing your first wife or your wife. And I know that you have to build some sort of defense system to allow you to get through it. And the last thing you want is for somebody to sort of put holes in that defense system until you're healed enough to deal with it yourself. So it was not a thing that made conversation worthwhile.
Mm-hmm. Well, we should be clear that no matter what someone's faith is, or they don't need to be a scholar to read this book and to look at the layering of Matthew over the Jewish liturgical year.
That's correct.
You choose a year based on what you believe the Jews were following in the times of their Babylonian captivity. It's dealt with in footnotes, but what happens is you begin with Passover, and then you can see week by week, reading by reading, how whenever there's a Jewish holiday, there's a story for Jesus that fits right in perfectly. If there's a 4-week span between 2 holidays, there's 4 stories. When it's time for the harvest, Jesus is telling stories about the seeds.
It really opened Matthew's gospel up so beautifully for me. Mm-hmm. And the easiest one of those holy day attractions to me is to combine Hanukkah or dedication with transfiguration. Because what Hanukkah, originally it was called dedication by the Jews. The word Hanukkah is simply the Hebrew word for dedication, but we call it Hanukkah in this country. What Hanukkah celebrated was the return of the light of God to the temple at the time of the Maccabees.
Mm-hmm.
It was set in the month of Kislev, the Jewish month of Kislev, which is sort of our December. It was set at the darkest time of the year, when every religion celebrates the return of the sun from the darkness back to life. You know, the ancient people weren't sure it would ever come back, so there's this horror of being in perpetual darkness. And by the time Mark, who writes that story first, and then Matthew takes it from Mark, writes about Jesus, there is no temple because the Romans have destroyed it in 70 in Jerusalem. And so they're trying to portray Jesus as the new temple upon whom the light of God comes. And so the story is that Jesus goes up on the mountain.
And is transfigured.
And he's joined with the primary figures of Judaism. Elijah, the father of the prophetic movement, and Moses, the father of the law. And they're all transformed. They become whiter than any Clorox on earth could have gotten them. Translucent whiteness. You can also go back and read stories in the Hebrew scriptures about Moses coming down on the mountain, and his skin is so bright with light that they have to put a cover over his face because the people couldn't see. So you recognize all these symbols, and you know that story is not literal. I mean, Moses had been dead for 1,200 years, and Elijah had been dead for 800 years. And they're not going to appear on the top of a mountain and have a conversation with Jesus unless you're in fantasy land somewhere. And so you're left, literally, that story makes no sense. And Peter wrestling with that story, Peter says, oh, this is wonderful, Lord. We've got you and Moses and Elijah. The twin towers of Israel are together with you, and we want to treat all of you as equal. We're going to build 3 tabernacles. That's high praise. Nobody had ever, the idea that Jesus would be in the company of Elijah and Moses, and on a basis of equality for a Jewish person would have been very high praise. And then the voice comes through from God, through a cloud or whatever, and says, no, you haven't quite got it right. This guy is different, because the Jews trying to interpret the Jewish Jesus as even greater than Moses, even greater than Elijah. Elijah and Moses find their fulfillment in Jesus, is sort of what that story is about. It's clearly a Christian story designed to interpret Jesus to a Jewish thinking world, using Jewish symbols that every Jewish reader would have understood and would have appreciated. And so it makes enormous sense where it made no literal sense to me at all.
Well, the prodigal son never made a lot of sense to me either, but that's out of the scope of this book.
Well, it's not really, because that's in Luke. It's only in Luke. It's interesting that when people talk about the parables of Jesus, the ones that they like the best are only in Luke. They're not in Mark, Matthew, or John. They haven't appeared anywhere else, and that's the prodigal son, the Good Samaritan, and the story of Lazarus and the rich man. Those are the 3 best-known, best-loved parables. But if you look at Luke, and I haven't done this yet, but Michael Golder has worked on this, if you put Luke against that liturgical background and against the reading of the Torah, you will find that there's a very appropriate lesson where the children in Deuteronomy are told that if they don't be completely obedient to their parents, and that they will be stoned to death. And the prodigal son is set against that. He's a very disobedient son.
As disobedient as it gets.
And instead of being stoned to death, he goes away, and then he, quote, comes to himself, and he comes back, and the everlasting arms of the loving Father are always there. And it's a really great parable. I think Luke wrote it. I don't think Jesus spoke it.
And it's to counter the idea that if your child even thinks of disobeying
That's
you,
correct.
you can kill them.
Yeah, it's a much deeper story when you get it in its Jewish context.
I still feel sorry for the other brother. It's like, hey, you never...
Well, he also represents there are also a lot
Human.
of people that think they're righteous, and their righteousness means that they can't ever forgive anybody or accept anybody else, because nobody measures up to their standards.
Mm-hmm.
It's a beautiful story with insight into human nature, I think.
Well, and when you talk about a Gentile heresy, that's the idea that forgetting the Jewish roots of the faith, forgetting the context. And 2 reasons. One you mentioned already was that there was this split, and the followers of Christ, the followers of the way, were officially split away, and also there was outside attacks on Jews. who was in power at the time. Was it still the Roman Empire?
Yes, sir.
And they were starting to attack the Jews, and the Christians were saying, well, heck, they found a safety net and said, well, we're not Jews. We're
That's
different
correct.
from them. So,
And you see that going on in the Gospels when Judas is made darker and darker as each Gospel goes by, and Pilate is made cleaner and cleaner as each Gospel goes by. Because what they're really doing is out of their need to survive, they're trying to gussy up to the Roman officials and identify the Jews as the bad guys.
it always helps to point out the Jews as the bad guy if you want to get a...
That's correct.
Yeah.
And you know, Matthew is very overt. Matthew has Pilate wash his hands publicly after and saying, I'm innocent of the blood of this just man. And then he has the Jewish crowd shout, his blood be upon me and upon our children. And that text has probably been the most evil text in the Bible in the history of the Christian faith, because it was used to justify anti-Semitism. They asked for it. They said they would accept the blame for the death of Jesus. It's been a terrible, terrible text to keep and to say this is the word of the Lord every time you hear it.
One can easily take any section of the Bible for ill or good, though, can't they?
Yes, it's not easy to do. One can also justify almost anything one wants to do if you search far enough in the biblical story.
Because some people think, well, if we just got... Some people confuse you with an atheist or a person who's anti-religion, and they think that you want to dismantle faith or you want to dismantle this, and some people argue, well, if we just get rid of religion, there wouldn't be all these bad things. And they point out, well, people will find another reason to kill and hate each other, even if there was never any.
I consider myself a God-intoxicated human being. It's just that I don't define God as a supernatural being who lives above the sky, and I haven't been able to do that since Copernicus in the 16th century.
Or since you were 10, perhaps.
Well, whatever. You know, I don't know when I learned about Copernicus, but the idea that there's this supernatural being up in the sky who's following you and writing down all your deeds, good deeds and misdeeds, and
Like
you're going to have
Santa.
to face the judge with that notebook open at the end of time was a powerful method of control. My mother used to tell me, son, now remember when I can't see you, God can. Well, that was pretty inhibiting. Though I was much more afraid of my mother than I was of God. She was an imminent threat. God was a distant threat. But that's what we've done, and we even use heaven and hell as control mechanisms. The whole purpose of heaven and hell is not to talk about life after death. The whole purpose is to control the way you live now. If you don't be a good boy, you're going to go to hell. If you are a good boy, you're going to go to heaven.
Or don't worry so much about your miserable life because you'll get a reward later. So
That's
just
correct.
keep slaving in the fields.
Yeah, it's an opiate for the people, as Mark said, because it means that oppressed people are taught to tolerate their oppression because they'll get their reward in the sweet by and by when they die in the sky, or whatever the old hymn said. I just think Christianity is not in the behavior control business. When I wrote a book on why I believe in life after death, and I do, I entitled it Eternal Life, A New Vision, with the subtitle being Beyond Religion, Beyond Theism, Beyond Heaven and Hell, because I think you've got to get beyond all of those things before you can talk about what I think life after death's all about. But that's another story.
Well, you've also said that this might be your last book, meaning there won't be another story from you, but of course you're online answering questions, writing essays, so you're not going to continue study, but do you think you're going to hold fast to that argument that you're not going to tackle Luke or whatever else might be
Well,
left for
I'd
you?
love to do that. I'll tell you the way I live. I spend about 3 hours a day in my study, literally studying and writing and working things out. And I'm going to do that whether I write a book or not. That's a pattern of a lifetime. I spend an hour exercising, and then I spend 3 hours. I don't eat breakfast until about 11:30, 12 o'clock. I come up from my study, famished. And now you do that all your life, and you're not going to stop. Now, whether you turn that into a book is the question. And, you know, there are a lot of issues that go into a book. A book is a lot different from writing a column once a week. It takes an enormous amount of effort, and the hardest part is not the writing. The hardest part is the editing and the footnoting and the gathering the bibliography and the working over every sentence to make sure it's good. And that's all takes place after you've written the manuscript. And it takes a couple of years to do that. So whether I'm 84 years old, whether I've got enough time to write another book's a question. right now I'm doing a series that I call Charting a New Reformation. I look at the various Christian symbols that have got to change because they don't make sense the way they're literally understood, and they can make sense if you look at them from a different perspective. And I've now done 20 of those. They're 1,500 page.
More than Martin Luther.
Yeah, they're more than 1,500 words in each of my essays, and I probably have maybe 40 more to go before I would get through my whole series. That'd give me maybe 60. 60 chapters, 5 pages each, would be 300 pages. You don't take columns and turn them into chapters, however, because when you're writing a weekly column, you repeat yourself frequently.
Mm-hmm.
You spend some time getting your audience from last week back on board for this week. When you're writing a book, you can't do that, so it would squeeze down. But it would be a book when I finish of 250, 275 pages, I would guess, and whether it would be publishable or not, I don't know. My publisher, HarperCollins, is very gracious to me, and I think they'll publish anything I write, whether it's good or bad, and that's always dangerous, because I don't want to write something that's published on my reputation and not worth publishing. So I'm a harsher critic than Harper would be, because all they care about is whether the book sells. If the book sells enough for them to break even, they'll publish it.
Mm-hmm.
If they're making a profit, that's just plus. But that's, I had a friend, a Quaker scholar, who wrote a book a year, and people would go up to him and say, well, what did you entitle your book this year? Because it was the same book with a different title every year. Nobody's got that much to say. And if you just are going to repeat yourself, it's not something you want. Your reputation is not going to be served by vain repetitions in writing. So I don't know whether I'll do that or not. I've written this column for about 16 years, 52 columns a year.
This is
for
at
about 16 years.
JohnShelbySpong.com.
Yeah. And, the bank is there, and people that take the column can go into the bank and look at anything. I'm not always positive about something I wrote 14 years ago because I've changed.
Mm-hmm.
But it's all there. There's a great body of work there. And they would recognize it, especially this book, Biblical Literalism, the Gentile Heresy, was hammered out in that column over a period of about 120 columns, about 2 years' work. And then I rewrote the whole thing, condensed it, took out all the repetitions, justified the things that people questioned, like when does the Jewish liturgical year start? That was a great big issue.
Mm-hmm.
And it needed to be faced because most Jews today start their new year with Rosh Hashanah. And that makes perfect sense. But there's a lot of evidence that they had another year that started with Passover. And starting with Passover makes sense because that's the birth of the nation.
So obviously, you still find intellectual satisfaction out of wrestling with the Bible and the scholarly work.
I do. I work on the Bible every day of my life. I've probably read the Bible from cover to cover 25 times. I've read it on every kind of perspective. I read it as a fundamentalist when I was a child. I read it as whatever you can be between that and whatever I am now as I went along. When I graduated from the seminary, none of the ideas that now embrace my life had been formed. Seminary was very traditional. It really was. Wouldn't have called itself fundamentalist because they dealt with biblical criticism, but they never drew any of the conclusions that one would have to draw. Your fundamentalism goes, so much more goes that they don't know about. If you accept Charles Darwin, for example, then the whole way we tell the Christian story has got to go, because the Christian story is based on something called original sin. Darwin says the world has never been perfect. It's always evolving. You can't fall from a world that's not perfect you can't fall from original perfection that doesn't exist into original sin that does exist. It's an evolutionary process. And the whole way of telling the Jesus story as the savior of the sinful, the rescuer of the lost, the redeemer of the fallen, makes no sense once you get rid of original sin. So it's not as if you can just sort of nibble around the edges. This whole story is like a central string. You pull it and the whole thing falls apart. And then you've got to decide whether there's some integrity and truth about this story that needs to be reshaped and reframed in language that will make sense to modern people. And I just find that an exciting lifetime of work.